Mark Twain, born November 30, 1835, Florida, Missouri. U.S. died April 21, 1910, Reading, Connecticut. Was an American humorist, journalist, lecturer, and novelist who acquired international fame for his travel narratives, especially The Innocents Abroad 1869, Roughing It 1872, and Life on the Mississippi 1883, and for his adventure stories of boyhood, especially The Adventures of Tom Sawyer 1876, and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn 1885. A gifted raconteur, distinctive humorist, and irascible moralist, he transcended the apparent limitations of his origins to become a popular public figure and one of America's best and most beloved writers. Samuel Clemens, the sixth child of John, Marshall, and Jane Lambton Clemens, was born 2 months prematurely and was in relatively poor health for the first 10 years of his life. His mother tried various allopathic and hydropathic remedies on him during those early years, and his recollections of those instances, along with other memories of his growing up, would eventually find their way into Tom Sawyer and other writings. Because he was sickly, Clemens was often coddled, particularly by his mother, and he developed early the tendency to test her indulgence through mischief, offering only his good nature as bond for the domestic crimes he was apt to commit. When Jane Clemens was in her 80s, Clemens asked her about his poor health in those early years. "I suppose that during that whole time you were uneasy about me?" "Yes, the whole time," she answered. "Afraid I wouldn't live?" "No," she said, "afraid you would." And so far as Clemens could be said to have inherited, his sense of humor, it would have come from his mother, not his father. John Clemens, by all reports, was a serious man who seldom demonstrated affection. No doubt his temperament was affected by his worries over his financial situation, made all the more distressing by a series of business failures. It was the diminishing fortunes of the Clemens family that led them in 1839 to move 30 miles, 50 kilometers east from Florida, Missouri, to the Mississippi River port town of Hannibal, where there were greater opportunities. John Clemens opened a store and eventually became a justice of the peace, which entitled him to be called judge, but not to a great deal more. In the meantime, the debts accumulated. Still, John Clemens believed the Tennessee land he had purchased in the late 1820s, some 70,000 acres, 28,000 hectares, might one day make them wealthy, and this prospect cultivated in the children a dreamy hope. Late in his life, Twain reflected on this promise that became a curse. It put our energies to sleep and made visionaries of us dreamers and indolent. It is good to begin life poor. It is good to begin life rich. These are wholesome, but to begin it prospectively rich, the man who is not experienced it cannot imagine the curse of it. Judging from his own speculative ventures in silver, mining, business, and publishing, it was a curse that Sam C.L. Emmons never quite outgrew. Perhaps it was the romantic visionary in him that caused Clemens to recall his youth in Hannibal with such fondness as he remembered it in old times on the Mississippi. 1875. The village was a white town, drowsing in the sunshine of a summer's morning until the arrival of a riverboat suddenly made it a hive of activity. The gamblers, stevedores, and pilots, the boisterous, raftsmen, and elegant travelers, all bound for somewhere surely glamorous and exciting, would have impressed a young boy and stimulated his already active imagination. And the lives he might imagine for these living people could easily be embroidered by the romantic exploits he read in the works of James Fenimore Cooper, Sir Walter Scott, and others. Those same adventures could be reenacted with his companions as well, and Clemens and his friends did play at being pirates, Robin Hood, and other fabled adventurers. Among those companions was Tom Blankenship, an affable but impoverished boy whom Twain later identified as the model for the character Huckleberry Finn. There were local diversions as well, fishing, picnicking, and swimming. A boy might swim or canoe too, and explore Glasscock's Island in the middle of the Mississippi River, or he might visit the labyrinthine McDowell's Cave about 2 miles 3 kilometers south of town. The first site evidently became Jackson's Island in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The second became McDougal's Cave-In, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. In the summers, Clemens visited his Uncle John Quarles's farm near Florida, Missouri, where he played with his cousins and listened to stories told by the slave Uncle Daniel, who served in part as a model for Jim and Huckleberry Finn. It is not surprising that the pleasant events of youth filtered through the softening lens of memory might outweigh disturbing realities. However, in many ways, the childhood of Samuel Clemens was a rough one. Death from disease during this time was common. His sister Margaret died of a fever when Clemens was not yet 4 years old. 3 years later his brother Benjamin died. When he was 8, a measles epidemic, potentially lethal as those days, was so frightening to him that he deliberately exposed himself to infection by climbing into bed with his friend Wilbowen in order to relieve the anxiety. A cholera epidemic a few years later killed at least 24 people, a substantial number for a small town. In 1847, Clemens's father died of pneumonia. John Clemens's death contributed further to the family's financial instability. Even before that year, however, continuing debts had forced them to auction off property, to sell their only slave, Jenny, to take in boarders, even to sell their furniture. Apart from family worries, the social environment was hardly idyllic. Missouri was a slave state, and though the young Clemens had been reassured that chattel slavery was an institution approved by God. He nevertheless carried with him memories of cruelty and sadness that he would reflect upon in his maturity. Then there was the violence of Hannibal itself. One evening in 1844, Clemens discovered a corpse in his father's office. It was the body of a California emigrant who had been stabbed in a quarrel and was placed there for the inquest. In January 1845, Clemens watched a man die in the street after he had been shot by a local merchant. This incident provided the basis for the Boggs shooting in Huckleberry Finn. 2 years later, he witnessed the drowning of one of his friends, and only a few days later, when he and some friends were fishing on Sny Island on the Illinois side of the Mississippi, they discovered the drowned and mutilated body of a fugitive slave. As it turned out, Tom Blankenship's older brother Bence had been secretly taking food to the runaway slave for some weeks before the slave was apparently discovered and killed. Bence's act of courage and kindness served in some measure as a model for Huck's decision to help the fugitive Jim in Huckleberry Finn. After the death of his father, Sam Clemens worked at several odd jobs in town, and in 1848 he became a printer's apprentice for Joseph P. Hammond's Missouri Courier. He lived sparingly in the Hammond household, but was allowed to continue his schooling and, from time to time, indulge in boyish amusements. Nevertheless, by the time Clemens was 13, his boyhood had effectively come to an end. Apprenticeships of Mark Twain. In 1850, the oldest Clemens boy, Orion, returned from St. Louis, Missouri, and began to publish a weekly newspaper. A year later, he bought the Hannibal Journal, and Sam and his younger brother Henry worked for him. Sam became more than competent as a typesetter, but he also occasionally contributed sketches and articles to his brother's paper. Some of those early sketches, such as the Dandy Frightening, the Squatter 1852, appeared in Eastern newspapers and periodicals. In 1852, acting as the substitute editor while Orion was out of town, Clemens signed a sketch, W. Epaminondas Adrastus Perkins. This was his first known use of a pseudonym, and there would be several more: Thomas Jefferson, Snodgrass, Quintius Curtius, Snodgrass, Josh, and others, before he adopted permanently the pen name Mark Twain. Having acquired a trade by age 17, Clemens left Hannibal in 1853 with some degree of self-sufficiency. For almost 2 decades he would be an itinerant laborer, trying many occupations. It was not until he was 37, he once remarked, that he woke up to discover he had become a literary person. In the meantime, he was intent on seeing the world and exploring his own possibilities. He worked briefly as a typesetter in St. Louis, in 1853 before traveling to New York City to work at a large printing shop. From there he went to Philadelphia and on to Washington, D.C. Then he returned to New York only to find work hard to come by because of fires that destroyed 2 publishing houses during his time in the East, which lasted until early 1854. He read widely and took in the sights of these cities. He was acquiring, if not a worldly air, at least a broader perspective than that offered by his rural background. And Clemens continued to write, though without firm literary ambitions, occasionally publishing letters in his brother's new newspaper. Orion had moved briefly to Muscatine, Iowa, with their mother, where he had established the Muscatine Journal before relocating to Keokuk, Iowa, and opening a printing shop there. Sam Clemens joined his brother in Keokuk in 1855 and was a partner in the business for a little over a year, but he then moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, to work as a typesetter. Still restless and ambitious, he booked passage in 1857 on a steamboat bound for New Orleans, Louisiana, planning to find his fortune in South America. Instead, he saw a more immediate opportunity and persuaded the accomplished riverboat Captain Horace Bixby to take him on as an apprentice. Having agreed to pay a $500 apprentice fee, Clemens studied the Mississippi River and the operation of a riverboat under the masterful instruction of Bixby with an eye toward obtaining a pilot's license. Clemens paid Bixby $100 down and promised to pay the remainder of the substantial fee in installments, something he evidently never managed to do. Bixby did indeed learn a word Twain insisted on him, the river, but the young man was an apt pupil as well. Because Bixby was an exceptional pilot and had a license to navigate the Missouri River and the upper as well as the lower Mississippi, lucrative opportunities several times took him upstream. On those occasions, Clemens was transferred to other veteran pilots and thereby learned the profession more quickly and thoroughly than he might have otherwise. The profession of riverboat pilot was, as he confessed, many years later in old times on the Mississippi, the most congenial one he had ever followed. Not only did a pilot receive good wages and enjoy universal respect, but he was absolutely free and self-sufficient. A pilot in those days was the only unfettered and entirely independent human being that lived in the earth, he wrote. Clemens enjoyed the rank and dignity that came with the position he belonged, both informally and officially, to a group of men whose acceptance he cherished, and by virtue of his membership in the Western Boatmen's Benevolent Association, obtained soon after he earned his pilot's license in 1859. He participated in a true meritocracy of the sort he admired and would dramatize many years later in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court 1889. Comments for part to video.